Welcome to Challenging Silence, a podcast from Women's Health and Women's Hands Community Health Center.
On this show, we are having much needed discussions about topics related to female genital mutilation or cutting with survivors, advocates, and community members. We're your hosts, Tomilola
and Nanti. Challenging Silence is brought to you by the Flourish Project, made possible through funding from Women and Gender Equality Canada.
You can listen to this podcast series on all major podcast listening platforms and our website, flourishaccess.ca.
Please note that this podcast covers topics of a sensitive nature, including domestic abuse and violence. To ensure privacy and safety, some guests have chosen to remain anonymous.
This podcast is age appropriate for 16 plus.
Like many women who have experienced gender-based violence, especially physical and sexual violence, FGMC survivors may endure long-term psychological impacts as a result of their traumatic experiences, a silent toll that is often misdiagnosed or in which many racialized women have limited access to support that they need for healing. Women's Health in Women's Hands Community Health Center is working to increase accessibility to mental health services for African, Caribbean, Black, Latin American, and South Asian women in the Greater Toronto area. At our center, counseling services employ a feminist, women-centered approach and takes place from the perspective that throughout history, women have possessed the strengths that have enabled them to cope with adverse situations. This approach to counseling focuses on women's strengths, capabilities, and resources rather than weakness and limitations. Today, we'll talk about the connection between mental health and gender-based violence, and we're joined by Wangari Kamande, one of our mental health therapists. Welcome, Wangari. Please tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and your work at the center.
Thank you, Tomilola. I'm really happy to be here and to talk with you about gender-based violence and the impact it has on the mental health of women. So my name is Wangari Kamande, as Tomilola mentioned. I'm a mental health therapist here at Women's Health and Women's Hands. I've been working here for the last almost 3 years. Before that, I've done work in the space of actually the impact of gender-based violence on children and families. So this is a topic that I'm very passionate about. And so I'm very excited to be here.
Welcome. And I'm glad to have you here today. When people think about the negative effects of FGMC and other forms of gender-based violence, there's often more focus on the physical impacts compared to the psychological impacts. To kick off this conversation, can you tell us about the mental health effects of survivors of gender-based violence?
Absolutely. So before I answer that question, I'm going to just start with a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is that people have unique experiences when it comes to gender-based violence, and the impact on their mental health will vary as the people are. So for instance, if somebody has had many other traumas while they were growing up, if they did not have family support, if they did not, come from a home where they were raised in a, relatively safe place, also their personality, that will impact how that mental health is impacted. So I just want to say that the experiences can be very unique. So some people might be very traumatized. The impact on their mind and their body can be so severe and debilitating. And there can be other people who are on the other side of really able to not be as feeling or appearing to be as traumatized as much. But that's just, that will vary for each individual. And obviously, if you've had a childhood where you've been supported, where you've been, you've had people who have loved you, you have multiple supports, you have access to resources, that it makes the violence less, but the impact in the body can be a bit less. But kind of moving on to your question on the mental health effects of survivors. So first of all, the experience of shame, right? Like this, I've allowed this thing, or this thing has happened to me and it's so embarrassing. How did I, that the feeling of disempowerment that comes from that, these feelings of shame, fear, anxiety, depression, feelings of sadness, the feeling of moving around in the world and feeling unsafe, lack of trusting self and others. It's like, oh my God, did I choose to be in a family or with a person who is, harming me, right? So that feeling of like, failing myself, but also like, can people be trusted if I made the decision to be with this person and now they're harming me? Do I even have a good judgment of character, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you start to want to protect yourself, right? And so then there are other things that can happen where, people have either very rigid boundaries. And by that, I mean like not wanting to talk with people, not wanting to collaborate or be able to work with other people just because they felt so unsafe. So they want to push people away, right? Like really away. And then the other extreme is having no boundaries at all. So people then, start to take advantage of the person who's been abused because, right, like there's been so many years maybe at this point where they haven't felt a sense of self in life because of the violence. And so that can make things really, really hard as people start to manipulate and take advantage. And then you start to feel like, like low self-esteem, right? Just low self-confidence and a really negative belief of self, right? The other thing that I think can sometimes happen is anger, right? Like anger towards self, anger towards others. So you find that sometimes people are kind of a little bit more reactive than usual, right? Because there's so much, we always say that anger is often like an expression that's easy when you're feeling very helpless, very powerless, feeling very depressed. And so anger is like, that feeling of like, I felt so powerless and I can only fight for myself now, right? So, outbursts of anger and rage can sometimes be a result.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned shame and fear is a very big one.
Yeah.
And at times it often stands for stigma and discrimination
Yes.
from family members or community members,
Yes.
especially in our Black African Caribbean cultures where they tend to focus on what did the survivor do versus why did the perpetrator choose to do this action.
Absolutely.
Sometimes there's too much focus on what did the woman do? Why didn't you do this with your husband versus what your husband did was wrong. So the shame and fear at times stems from that. That's why they tend to be quiet and might not want to reach out or talk to anybody about it.
Yeah, absolutely. You're so right in saying that. And even the fact that in certain places, like violence is so normalized, right? Like within, we're talking about this African Caribbean context where, it's like if you're especially taking a religious position where you're expected to submit to a man or a husband, whatever the case might be, then, the feeling is like, you shouldn't complain, like just take it. Right?
Yeah.
Like take it. This is almost expected of you, which is, it's not right. And no one deserves to be, abused. But yeah, absolutely. That shame can keep somebody in an abusive situation for very, very long. And it can have like really horrible impact long-term on their mental well-being, their health. And to be honest, we talk about the physical, the body, but mental health and the body are so connected. And people get sick, like somatic symptoms, people get other diseases just out of just the suffering that they're, from the stress that they've experienced in these abusive situations.
For sure. And speaking of that long term, unresolved trauma may lead to various coping mechanisms that are negative, such as substance abuse, avoiding the issue, self-isolation. What would you say are the consequences of not addressing the mental health impacts of gender-based violence, especially during the youth and young adult stages of life?
Thank you for that question. I really like the focus on the youth and young adult part of the life stages. Obviously, especially because here in Canada, I think a few years ago, the statistics I saw was that the population of young adults and youth who are getting abused, experiencing, gender-based violence in relationships, in their households is so high, and the numbers continue to spiral. So I really like that question. I would say that, there are so many consequences. When you're young, if you can imagine, when you're just a young person and you're just coming to yourself, this is the first time you're starting to determine who you are outside your family system, right?
Yeah.
So this is a very tender stage in life, I would say. I want to call it a tender stage because you're trying to figure out, who am I as a young woman? Who am I, as a human being? And so if your experiences in relationships initially are to be, pretty much violated and abused, and you're not getting the support, the consequences can be that you start to have a view of yourself that's really negative, right? Like you start to view yourself as something is wrong with me. I'm not good enough. There's some, I'm maybe not worth, I'm not valuable. Again, those things that we mentioned even above, right? Like the depression and the anxiety, that shame and fear, I think shame and fear will continue to use those words because they are very consistent with abuse. Starting to feel like you don't, because your experiences of quote unquote love feel like very unsafe. You start to feel like maybe there's no safe place for you in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that can result in a lot of self-harming, and there's many ways people self-harm, whether it's cutting themselves or whether it's, abusing drugs. It doesn't have to be, it can be even medication, it can be prescription drugs. It can be that people start to have suicidal thoughts, which are very common, and feeling ashamed about having those suicidal thoughts. Yet it's a really common experience when you feel like you just want the pain to end, right?
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, sometimes people attempt to die by suicide. And, because that sense of self, again, has been so oppressed, right? Like that feeling of like, I'm unworthy, that feeling of like, I don't matter, that the negative beliefs that arise from being abused.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that it's so important to, when we think about this season of a young woman's life, that it's so important that they get the help. That the help that they need. The other thing I wanted to mention is that you can also, again, I speak about this anger, like moving in the world with a lot of anger, and that can make it very hard to have any healthy relationships, right? So if you're, you start maybe fighting with others or isolating a lot. The other thing is that if you think that abuse, this is the only way life is going to be, you can then start to really think, okay, this is what it's supposed to be. And so you get into a cycle of abusive relationships, and that becomes the standard, which is actually not the case, but that becomes such a real experience because of the negative beliefs from those relationships.
Yeah, definitely. Viewing self as less valuable, not deserving, it does lead to self-harming and thinking that violence is the norm. And it can cause downward spiral, negative physical health impacts, and even death.
Yeah.
And we know that among some immigrant and refugee communities, discussion about mental health or mental illness is a taboo.
Yeah.
So even if they are going through this downward spiral, at times they don't seek help.
Yes.
And there's a lot of stigma, discrimination, stereotypes that follow individuals who do choose to open up about their mental health struggles.
Right.
In your experience, what are successful ways to break these barriers in order to reach and support women of color who are struggling with their mental health?
That's a really good question. I mean, one thing I would like to say is that I feel like something happened with the pandemic in terms of opening up dialogues around mental health, just because of during COVID, so many things people were experiencing so many things, the destruction of work, the destruction of other things was in some cases really not there. And so the symptoms, right, like the depression, those things, and people start to feel like even the entry of saying, the impacts of COVID as an entryway into getting help was a one way to get people coming to therapy for the stress of isolation, the stress of missing their family and stuff like that. So that has been, I think, helpful in opening a door into the therapy world. The thing that I find so helpful, and here at Women's Health, we do this, we have some programs related to this, is all the community programs that we have, right? So I find groups and community programs, whether they're focused on empowerment of women, whether they're focused on the youth, like the networking group, whether they are focused within the population health team and the mental health team, we have this group called a Women to Women Circle, and it's a peer-led group. Ideally, we coordinate, we manage it, but we let the peers discuss the topics of the day. So it can be very basic topics like dealing with stress in the winter, dealing with depression in the winter, or how to eat, well and take care of your mental health at different seasons of your life, or dealing with grief. And COVID was a good part of that, like dealing with grief and loss. So things that are very general, and people come to those groups that would otherwise not come. But being in a group like that and people having to witness others talking about it, even though they may be quiet in the group, that already starts to give a soft landing into the idea of like, oh, you mean this is common? You mean other people are experiencing this and are needing some help, right? So I find groups, and we do that quite well here, like all the community groups that are run at the center, they really provide a good landing space. Even the groups that are related to very much, like maybe not necessarily related to mental health, but maybe related to even diabetes care, lifestyle and stuff, they are entryways, right? Because people talk about different things that impact, how diabetes impacts their mental health. And that's an entryway. So I would say community groups are really, really helpful in this.
Yeah, for sure. Group-based support does draw people in. The sense of togetherness and peers leading each other, community-ness, even though that's not a word, but
listen, we make it as we go.
Exactly. It works. And their individuals might be more likely to go to a group than the one-on-one.
Yes.
They feel like, okay, I can be quiet and listen. And that listening sometimes is the start.
Yes.
And it's helping.
Yes.
And eventually when I get comfortable with the concept of therapy and counseling, then I can go to the one-on-one.
Yes, absolutely.
And what tips would you give to FGMC survivors or other women who have experienced trauma in achieving mental wellness? Maybe they're not ready to go to a mental health therapist, but what tools at home would you normally give your clients to help with their mental wellness?
Right. Okay. So, it's interesting because when I think about that question, obviously you want people to get help, like to go and seek help. But I think it's a great question because woman abuse of whatever kind, it doesn't have to be even physical. It can be just the emotional, the sexual, like the financial, spiritual, like all the types of abuse on women can cause such different effects on the body and the mind. And one of the things I always want to say to every woman, if they can hear it in their heart, no matter what, that it is never their fault. And while, some people might not be ready for therapy, I think the important thing is to starting by, if they can recognize that it's never their fault, no one deserves to be abused. No one ever deserves to be abused.
For sure.
But, if I'm thinking about specific tips, one of the things I would like to say is that when we've experienced abuse, it's very traumatic, and that impacts how we think about ourselves, how we feel in our body. I'm going to give an example. Like we start to have triggers, and the reason I give this example is so that the tips kind of connect with what I'm trying to describe. So sometimes, women will smell something and it reminds them about the abuse, right? Sometimes the women will hear sound and it will be very scaring to them, right? And it's triggering. Exactly. These are the different triggers, right? Sometimes when looking at maybe if they have a child who looks like the abuser, it can be very triggering for them, or even in an environment of the language or hearing sounds that very much relate to the environment, or even if they're in a place where they can see things that look very similar, it can bring up things and they're like, I don't know why, for some reason I started hyperventilating or breathing really fast and feeling very uncomfortable, or even what we call dissociating, right? Like this feeling of like you're leaving your body, right? Because something has happened. It could be something you saw, smelled, felt, heard, even a story, a word, or a movie, something that has triggered that feeling. And so the tips that we offer women when they come to therapy, and that's why sometimes it's really good to be in therapy or even in a group where you can hear more. If you don't want to do therapy, like a psychoeducation group around gender-based violence, it can be very helpful because to understand how your brain has been impacted by this and to also know that you can heal. So the strategies and the tips that we offer are things that help to really soothe your nervous system. Because what happens when you've experienced abuse is those things that we mentioned, but also you can sometimes become very hypervigilant. And what that means is like you're looking around, being very cautious where you are, looking around you, because that's what you had to do when you were abusive. You had to really plan, make yourself be silent or be quiet or do things so that the abuser didn't hurt you or harm you or whatever the case might be. So in this case, there are things about you that sometimes maybe you get startled very easily, or you get, you're very conscious of your surroundings, and that makes you really anxious and tense and on edge. And so we want to do things that help soothe your nervous system. We want to help you relax, especially if you've come to a place of safety, right? Like we want that to really happen. So some of the strategies we use are, first of all, we normalize those trauma responses, that when your body's reacting like this, it's just saying, I need something to help me calm down. And that's okay. Secondly, we use physical grounding tools. So these are tools that will focus on your body, your senses. They can be useful for what I said, dissociating or being anxious, feeling disconnected from your body. And this can include pretty much just a deep breathing, like taking a deep breath in and exhaling out. There are different ways of breathing. There's so many ways of breathing. And some people get triggered by breathing, especially if they were abused by choking. So we provide different styles. Sometimes you might have to breathe like a little puppy, like to help calm yourself down, especially if that is something that triggers you. 4 square, breathing in, then holding for 4 seconds before you exhale, and then holding, and then doing the whole cycle again, right? So really taking time to really regulate your breath. Your breath is up, people think, oh, that's so just breathing. Breathing is very powerful. Like this is something that everyone has been given as a gift to be able to breathe. And it's the one way to regulate and soothe your nervous system. Taking deep breaths. Second thing is, you can run cool or warm water on your hands, sometimes because losing the sense of presence when you're in a triggered state. Running cold water in your hands or some warm water for some people, that can be really helpful to bring you back to the present moment. Touching objects around you. Sometimes we encourage people who have experienced abuse, like just have something in your bag that feels comforting for you. Some people will have their rosary and they'll touch that, or a religious tool that they have in their bag, or something soft, just something that brings you soothing, because when you touch something, you feel really grounded into something, right? Holding something. Even like being at home and rocking on a pillow, that can really feel grounding, because you're rocking yourself, like almost like you're giving yourself a hug with a pillow, but you're also doing that motion of rocking, which we do for babies. But rocking can be very soothing. That movement is very soothing, especially when you're feeling on edge. The other thing is you can also focus on, what we call it progressive muscle relaxation. This is just when you start to tense parts of your body, tense different muscles of your body, and then relax each muscle of your body and feel the difference as you relax each muscle of your body. Because when we're anxious, we get tense. We hold our shoulders up, we sometimes our fists are tightened. You try and feel that movement of relaxing your body. And then the other thing I would say with physical grounding is stretching and other movement. Here at Women's Health and Women's Hands, we have various movement-based programs that are very healing. Movement is so healing for your body. Even if it's dancing, we have dancing programs here. We have yoga, different types of yoga here. We have Tai Chi and Qigong. All these are practices that are helpful for healing the body. And we know that trauma is held in the body. So when you do this movement-based programming, we hear all the time women really happy that, oh my God, when I started to do this movement, I started to feel like something was moving in my body, right? I started to feel like, oh, like something was like really, really shifting, because that's what happens. It's like your body just goes sometimes into a very freeze state, or like into like a very anxious flight stage, or even sometimes when we are just caught up with like trying to please everybody. Obviously, there are many trauma responses that your body might have, and movement is one of the ways to help relieve that. So with physical grounding. So the other thing is mental grounding. And this is a focus on activating your mind to cope with feelings of anxiety, distress or discomfort while remaining present. So if you're feeling like something feels very intense in the moment, which can happen anytime, like sometimes it's helpful to picture or image a safe place. Right? So sometimes women will picture like a safe place that maybe it's not even a place you've been to, or maybe it's a place even you've seen on a TV screen, or somebody has told you about this place, or somewhere that you found that was safe when you're in your childhood that brings this comfort to you. It's so important to really picture that place in great detail. The power of your imagination is so, so great. It's funny, people don't realize how imagination is powerful. I can sit here for a few seconds and imagine that somebody's about to attack us from that door, and I'll get anxious, even though we are relatively safe where we are. So using your imagination to soothe yourself is so important. So you can think about the safe place, and maybe say, for instance, if your safe place is like a beach, you can imagine yourself being there, the smells that you hear there, the sounds that you hear there, the feeling of either the sand or the water, whatever is soothing for you. Imagine that environment that brings your body back to the present moment. That's one way. Sometimes describing your environment in great detail, so like even here, like blue wall, red table, black chairs, 5 women here, like describing your environment in detail, it just starts to teach your brain to focus on the present moment. Because when you've been in an abusive situation, you're always just looking around. You're not normally present. You're really just always trying to look for safety constantly. So mental grounding, naming 5 things you see, 4 things you hear, 3 things you can smell, 2 things you can taste, using your senses to be able to bring yourself to the present moment. And lastly, Tamilola, is emotional grounding, which is the focusing on your body and activating your mind to increase relaxation feelings and feelings of safety and comfort. So listening to music that comfort, right? Listening to things that are comforting you. If you're somebody who listens to religious text or whatever it is that brings comfort to you, listening to things like that. Keeping quotes, poetry, songs, song lyrics, scripture, or whatever it is that reminds you of something comforting around you. And it could be even just on a post-it note, it can be on the jewelry you wear, it can be on anything, just reminders of things that give you hope and strength and bring comfort to you. It can be even something that you wrote for yourself, whether it's like, I have overcome, I have survived, and I will survive. Anything that just reminds you of that can be really, really helpful. And then scent. So the sense of smell is a very powerful thing. And I'd want to encourage women, when you're feeling triggered, the fastest thing to bring you into your present moment is smell. If you have a smell that you like, that is comforting to you, having something in your bag or around you that smells that way that you can sniff, very, very helpful in bringing you back to the present moment. And, and also, as I said, that it can also be triggering depending on what it is, but you want to think of something that's obviously soothing. The other thing is taking care of yourself. So making a meal that you enjoy, like doing things, when you're in an abusive situation, you're so focused on protecting yourself that sometimes you don't really fully take care of yourself. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways is to start doing things that really feel good for you. So making a meal that you like. This is basic self-care stuff, right? So having a shower and feeling, how does the water feel on your body? Does it feel nice? Do you like the smell of the soap? Whatever makes you feel good, whether it's a cold or hot shower, it doesn't matter, but doing something that helps you feel calm. Now, for some people who, especially when they've experienced a lot of trauma and they're experiencing deep depression, I sometimes say having a cold shower can be really, really helpful in soothing another part of your being, that's the vagus nerve. Watching things that are funny, things that make you laugh, right? Yeah. Realizing that, it's okay that you can feel sad and you can even experience depression, but you can also have times of laughter. We are not just linear human beings. We have multiple experiences. We can be having the hardest time of our lives and still be able to enjoy laughter, mm-hmm. for instance. And then I would say with all these grounding practices, it's so important to practice. This is not a one size fits all. Practice as many, and you can Google them online if you want, right? And also give yourself just goals that make sense. You feel like, oh my gosh, I can't do all these things. Do just something. If breathing is the only thing you can do and taking care of yourself, do that, right? Mm-hmm. And you also want to be able to do what works best for you. Not every grounding tool, not every tool will work for everybody. Do whatever works best for you and stick to it. And I would say that, and also be kind to yourself. Healing is a journey. Just be kind to yourself in the process. And I would say lastly, that surrounding yourself with a community and people who are supportive and feel good for you is quite important in your healing journey.
Thank you for that. You've given such great tips to our listeners: breathing, movement, mindfulness. And as you said, whatever works for you. One thing might work for one person, another thing might work for another person. But the good part about the tips you've given, there's a range of different things. So hopefully our listeners can pick something and it will work for them in their journey of mental health wellness. What a difficult yet important and educative topic that we've discussed. Thank you, Wangari, for being with me here today.
Thank you for having me.
The prevalence of mental health consequences among women who have underwent FGMC or experienced other forms of gender-based violence cannot be ignored. We just hope that survivors who need help will seek help, whatever way works for them.
Yes.
Though recommendations continue to be formulated to help address these consequences, there's a need for more rigorous research on the topic and focus on female genital mutilation and cutting in Canada. A lot of the mental health talk about gender-based violence, physical and sexual violence, but a lot of therapists and counselors have not had much experience or knowledge with FGMC. So there definitely is a need for more focus so that survivors can get the help that they need, that's unique to them.
I agree. Yeah.
While this work continues to be done, let's continue to support survivors and impacted communities. In our next episode, we'll be discussing the role men and boys play in combating gender-based violence.